Everyone, hope you're having a good summer. Welcome to today's webinar on advanced accessibility, interactive interfaces. For those who don't know me, I'm Peggy Wright, Director of Digital Learning at WGBH and project lead for WGBH's SciAct project, which is bringing the universe to America's classrooms. And today's webinar is presented by NCAM, the National Center for Accessible Media, and WGBH Education. So our goal today is to explore principles of accessible interaction, and we'll do that through case studies of accessible games built for our BUAC project. And as many of you know who have already signed up for these one-on-one consultations, in the follow-up consultations, we will focus on applying these ideas to your own interactive materials. I shouldn't say we, you're going to be having follow-up consultations with NCAM. If any of you are interested and haven't signed up, please contact Ethan. He will put his email in the chat box and let us know. And I know Ethan will be reaching out with more information about scheduling those meetings later this week. So as you know, if you've attended previous NCAM webinars, NCAM has worked with us from year one on our BUAC project, and they've helped us develop our accessibility Section 508 strategy, and they've of course guided us in developing all of our media for K-12 students. So working with them has been invaluable to our larger effort. And let me introduce today's presenters. We have, again from NCAM, Madeline Rothberg, who has led research on access to educational multimedia, health, IT, and transit communications. And Madeline helped launch metadata standards for accessibility now in use in accessible publications worldwide. Claire Houston is also with us from NCAM. She's an accessibility analyst with experience in disability advocacy and tech policy. And she previously interned as a Google Public Policy Fellow at the American Association of People with Disabilities. And finally, our first presenter is Anna Brooks from our own BUAC team. She's a senior media producer. Anna manages a range of media-based digital learning projects for WGBH Education, and she has overseen the integration of accessibility into our resources from year one of our BUAC project. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Anna, who's going to start the presentation, and thanks very much for coming.
Thank you, Peggy. Welcome, everyone. So first, we'll start with just a bit of background on the accessibility approach that we've taken with BUAC. Our project is organized into collections based on grade band and topic. Each grade band topic collection is a purposefully curated resource set designed to support next generation science standards implementation. A collection contains some number of media resources, which are comprised of media assets like videos, interactives, games, and interactive lessons developed by our in our interactive lesson platform. And most collections contain at least one lesson plan, which features one or more media resources and additional handouts. And all of these are supported by a variety of inclusive supports for students who are English learners or use assistive technologies. So to focus now on students who use assistive technologies, the BUAC project strives to make all resources accessible, as Peggy mentioned, 508 compliant. But given time and budget constraints around making everything fully accessible, our goal is to ensure that at least one resource that addresses a key standard that we're targeting is made fully accessible, and more in a moment on what fully accessible means. So a teacher focusing on a particular standard will be able to select at least one resource that will be fully accessible to students who use assistive technologies. Wherever possible, that is a lesson plan or an interactive lesson, but because they help students achieve a specific learning objective. However, it can also be a regular media resource if that's more appropriate. And we also take into consideration whether there's a key resource that many teachers will want to use, such as a fascinating new interactive activity. So in the BUAC collection, all videos are closed captioned, and all videos and all images have text equivalents or alt text. But what does it mean for a BUAC resource to be fully accessible? For us, this means that we strive to ensure that all students, including those using assistive devices, can access the resource content in order to achieve the learning goal. So this can include adding descriptive audio or other non-visual supports for students who are blind or visually impaired. And if we could go to the next slide. So the resources in BUAC can contain different types of media assets. Images can include things like satellite imagery, data displays, or photographs. Videos can feature informational videos with narration like Nova clips, or they can be more data-driven like NASA visualizations. And interactives can include a range such as slideshows, data layering experiences, timelines, games, and more. So today we're going to focus on accessibility for these types of interactive interfaces. And now I'll pass it on to Madeline.
Hi, everyone. So we're going to talk to you about a range of different kinds of interactive experiences today, and I hope that some of these will seem familiar to the kinds of challenges you're working on. And along the way, I'll talk about what was important to us in each interaction, and then at the end, I'll try to sum that up with some principles. So here's a game that we created. It's called Plum's Island Explorer, and it was built in Unity. And Unity is a 3D navigational platform. You can see the picture on the left side. It's a landscape that the user wanders around using the mouse or the keyboard, and there's an overhead map view, as you can see, and the activity is for students to travel around this island and visit lots of different landforms and learn about them. So we were able to make the Unity interaction fully keyboard accessible. That's a feature that was available. We could have probably made this Unity game fully accessible for a blind student, but we decided that it wasn't worth both the development effort and the cognitive load that would be involved. So to make this kind of free-form wandering around a landscape accessible to a user who can't see would have required a lot of extra feedback on their keyboard interactions to help them understand where they were navigating in the island. And then the payoff really is relatively limited for that amount of effort of navigation. So what we decided instead was that the Unity game would be fully mouse and keyboard accessible, and that we would build an alternative interactive lesson that would be more efficient and enjoyable for screen reader users. So both versions offer audio instructions and audio content about the learning goals, and they offer on-screen text that goes with it. So if you look at the right side of the screen, this is a screenshot from the interactive lesson. And we split it up into a linear experience through 32 pages, where on each page you get some text and images as well as audio. So the images for students who have some vision are still there. They're in good resolution and they're vivid. And then there's image description, which is gives a student who can't see the image a full set of the information they need to learn the lesson. And then there's the same content that the students got elsewhere. There are also some embedded videos. The videos are offered with captions and with audio description where needed. And it's all embedded in a navigational structure that's clearer and easier to move through than the Unity is for students who can't see. We also think this lesson will be useful in cases where if a school system's internet connection isn't strong enough for the Unity process to be smooth, or if the computers are a little bit older, because Unity can be a little bit funky. I was actually hoping to demo that for you today, and as I tested it, I found that Unity had a tendency to drop audio and then bring it all back and play it to me all at once, and I didn't think that would be a great experience for this webinar. So sometimes the linear experience is just a better way to go. Here's another example. It's a simulation that we developed of the Earth, Moon, Sun system, and we use it over a range of different grade levels with different levels of complexity. I think this is the most complex one you can see here with all the controls. So we built this to be a hands-on way of exploring how the Earth, the Moon, and the Sun move around each other. And so we've made it fully keyboard accessible. We've paid good attention to the color contrast so that students with visual impairments that impact color can use it easily. We've added instructions and made the user interface elements really clear so that it's easy to discover how to use it from the keyboard. But again, to make this accessible for a non-visual student, the level of image description was going to be difficult, and it's not, it doesn't feel hands-on in the way it does for a sighted student. So we decided that a better alternative for non-visual students was a more hands-on event in their classroom with their teacher and their classmates. And so we've produced, as you see on the right, fully detailed descriptions of how to put together a lesson that a teacher can implement relatively easily to help students learn about the Earth, the Moon, and the Sun. And this is just one example. We have some other activities we created that are involve tactile graphics. So we suggest to students, for example, cutting out the shapes of moons out of textured paper so that students can learn about the phases of the moon in a hands-on way. And there's a whole range of activities that students can do when the best way to do it for them is hands-on and tactile. Here's another simulation for older students. It's an eclipse. And in this case, the focus of this lesson was on partial versus total eclipses and the umbra versus the penumbra. And so the simulation is really rich in data. Students can animate the presentation and move through it over time and watch the eclipse move around the globe. They can also look at data for different cities. They can interrogate different locations and look at the percentage of coverage for the eclipse in those different locations. And so to get at this kind of rich data for non-visual users, we decided the best alternative was to give them some data. So you can see on the right one portion of the non-visual support for this lesson. And it involves extracting data so that students can do a real data analysis experience, which is supports the learning goals for this activity. There's also other supports where we have larger tables of data with even more information when we want students to do detailed data analysis. So those are some examples of thinking about the core importance of this lesson and what's more important, the visuals or the data. In this case, it was really the data that was important. Finally, I want to show you an example of an accessible game. And some games can be made fully accessible. So I've just showed you some examples where we didn't make the original materials fully accessible, but there's certainly some that can be. And so now I'm going to show you a screen reader demo of the game Ruff Ruffman's Ring of Fire travel blog. And this game has been made entirely accessible with keyboard access, with audio and text on screen, with descriptions of the images and keyboard and screen reader accessible navigation. It's always a little bit tricky demoing a screen reader through a presentation. So be patient with me if this doesn't all go, but let's give it a try. Okay, here we are in Safari with, and I'm going to turn on VoiceOver. So you're going to hear a voice, and you should also see a little box. VoiceOver offers an option to see on screen the text that's being spoken. So that may help you follow along, and let's see how this works.
VoiceOver has joined the meeting. Ring of Fire blog window. New tab button has keyboard focus. This item has a help tag.
Terrific. So here we are in the Ring of Fire game, and let's move forward and see what
Emily Lou has joined the meeting. Heading level 1, 3 items. Ruff's inbox 5 unread.
So here we've got text that says Ruff's inbox 5 unread, and it matches the visuals.
Open email. Aleutian Mountains/Islands. The Cleveland volcano is button.
And here we have for each button the text of the email subject read aloud.
Open email. Kamchatka Peninsula/Kuril Islands. Dear Ruffy, my ext button.
And we can move through and pick which one of these emails we
open.
want to open.
Email.
So
open email.
Aleutian
Mountains/Islands. The Cleveland volcano is button.
Dear Ruffy, the Aleutian Islands include some of the most active volcanoes in the United States. It's a perfect place to visit on my Extreme Earth tour, but I'm not sure about this information on your blog. Mount Cleveland is the only active volcano in the area. No one lives near Mount Cleveland, so when it erupts, airplanes are not affected. This volcano is almost perfectly symmetrical. That means it's even on all sides. Please check them to make sure they're all correct. Love, Grandma.
Fix button.
So the premise of this game is that Ruff's travel blog has errors, and Grandma Ruffman has sent him emails telling him what to fix. So the students are going to learn more about the Ring of Fire in order to detect the errors in these statements. So now we'll move on. So here we are in the fix screen, and let's read through the screen and hear what there is on the screen.
Ring of Fire blog, web content, questions, region. Heading level 2, questions. Check these. List 4 items.
So here's the screen reader navigating through, and it's let me know that there are 4 items in this section, and the section is named questions.
Mount Cleveland is the only active volcano in the area, 1 of 4.
So the first question is Mount Cleveland the only active volcano in the area? And I'm going to move through the rest of the questions quickly so I can show you a little bit about the resources the student will use to learn about them.
Select true radio button. James Harold to everyone. Select false keyboard access. Seems to be important. Is this still useful for mobile apps? Do people use tablets with add-on keyboards and an expectation that apps will support keyboard input?
Okay, I think that probably VoiceOver is picking up people putting questions into the chat. So if I could ask you just for the time being not to put any more information into the chat just while I finish up this screen reader demo, and then we'd be happy to have your questions in the chat or elsewhere later. Sorry about that. It's definitely a feature for a blind user who's in a Zoom presentation and needs to know when the chat goes off. But as you can see, you also get a little bit of audio interference from that.
No one lives near Mount Cleveland, so when it erupts, airplanes are not affected, 2 of 4.
So I'm just going to move quickly through these to get us to the next section.
Dimmed button.
So there's the done button, and it's dimmed because it's not active until you answer the questions.
End of list.
And there's the end of that list of questions.
End of questions region. Research materials region.
So here's our next region, the research materials. So you can see that we've really intentionally structured the screen for screen reader users and told them what's in each section so that they can understand as they navigate around what they're looking at.
Heading level 2, research materials.
Heading markup, always useful.
Go back to inbox button.
There's the button if we wanted to go back.
Open magazine button.
And now we have our resources. Magazine.
Open book button.
A book.
Open tablet button.
A tablet.
Open brochure button.
And a brochure. So let's see what's inside this tablet.
Open tablet button. Close tablet button. Online reviews. Web dialog.
And now we've got our close button and then our online material.
Heading level 2. Official Extreme Earth Reviews. A symmetrical, cone-shaped volcano that has streaks of snow on its sides and is on the shore of a body of water. Image.
So there's our image description. So it was important that each of the images within these materials be well described because sometimes the image is the information that a student needs to answer their question. So for example, we've got a question here about whether or not the volcano is symmetrical. And here this image description tells us that it's a picture of a symmetrical mountain. So that's really good information.
Mount Cleveland. Mount Cleveland is a very active volcano. It has erupted 22 times in the past 230 years. Here are ratings of recent eruptions.
So the premise here being that these are our TripAdvisor style recommendations about this volcano and its eruptions.
Helga, Austria, 2009. The 3 eruptions this year were spectacular, darling. I saw them all. One note. If you fly here during an eruption, it will take longer, because your plane will have to fly around all the smoke.
So there's some information for one of our other questions. We were supposed to be finding out whether airplanes are affected by volcanic eruptions from this volcano, and here's an answer. So you get the idea here. The students are working through the questions, looking through the materials. We've described the images, all the text is accessible, and the question and answer mechanism is accessible. And that means that we don't need a second version for this resource because we're able to make it fully accessible right where it is. So let me turn this off.
Voiceover off.
And now Anna is going to speak about some other tools that we built to work around the media resources.
All right. So I'm going to be talking about our interactive lessons. So our interactive lessons are built in a platform developed at WGBH, and these appear as resources on PBS LearningMedia. They provide media-focused, self-contained, self-paced experiences that most students can do independently or in small groups. Students go through the lesson pages one by one, where they read information and then watch videos or use interactive activities. As with the other media resources, the videos are closed captioned, and as this example on the left side of your screen, they can include alternate video with descriptive audio. So that's the descriptive video button there. And sometimes an alternate handout with descriptions that can be read with a screen reader, like the examples of the handouts you've seen. So students also complete various assessments using plug-in tools that are part of the interactive lesson platform. They may be asked to answer a question or a prompt by writing in an answer. They can do a drawing, read and highlight text, and drag and drop text or images onto a background. Wherever possible, these tools are made keyboard and screen reader accessible. So in the example on the right, students are asked to drag the character to the type of weather for which they are properly dressed. This activity is keyboard accessible, so students can complete it without needing to use a mouse or a trackpad to drag and drop the characters into the appropriate scene. So next slide, please. So as Madeline mentioned, it's not always possible to do everything in the tech side of the tools. So where it isn't possible to make these assessments accessible, for example, even if something isn't screen reader friendly because of too much imagery, we provide alternate activities or other supports. For younger students, this is often in a handout and teacher led. In the case of the different types of weather activity that you just saw that screenshot of, we provide a handout with image descriptions that a teacher can use to have a discussion with their student and then allow the student to verbally respond to the prompt to show their understanding. So we provide the image descriptions in an offline format and the teacher can write it in for younger students who aren't expected to necessarily be able to fully write their own answers. For older students, we have added a file upload functionality to allow independent use of alternate activities. So here you can see our arrange it activity in which students drag the planets into the correct positions in the planetary system. Students who require supports click to download a Word document, and there's a shot of that at the bottom right. And that has been optimized for accessibility with appropriate formatting for use with screen readers and image descriptions. After they fill it out, they can upload it back into the platform so that all of their work in the lesson is saved in the same place, and teachers who access that work for all students will be able to access the materials together. And then back to Madeline for the next slide.
So here's a little bit of a summary of where we find ourselves with the principles for these kinds of interactivities. We want to use universal design. We want as much as possible to make every resource fully accessible. But when we need to, and when we can't provide universal design embedded in a single object, we use equally effective alternatives. Equally effective is important because if students can't learn the core learning goals of the material that you're providing, then they're locked out entirely. So it's important to think about that carefully. We are able to include in every resource we publish good color contrast. Make sure that you're picking colors that work well together, that there are free color contrast checkers available. So any piece of text or information that you've got that you're sharing on your screen should always be shared with good color contrast. And in addition, in any environment, you can provide captions or transcripts for audio, as well as using audio to support reading in cases where you think your students might do better listening than reading text on the screen. But it's important to always have both so that you're supporting audiences across that hearing spectrum. You can almost always include keyboard access in an interactive activity. There are a few things that are drawing based where there's no way to do the activity without students creating custom curves and shapes on a screen, and those may be difficult to make keyboard accessible. But in general, nearly everything can be made fully keyboard accessible for students who can see, and this includes always providing a clear, visible focus so that as a student uses the resource from the keyboard, they always know exactly where their keyboard focus is. You want to think about a logical and efficient keyboard navigation. Keyboard navigation, generally speaking, will start at the top left and move across and down. But if your activity requires some really specific interactions, you may want to customize that keyboard navigation to support students in the thing that you know they need to do next after they take an action, for example. And you may need to provide instructions. So if you're creating a fairly novel user interface that's a little different, then you may need to have a tutorial up front. And I didn't get to show you, but the Unity Plum Island Navigator has a whole tutorial right up front that teaches the users how to use it from either the mouse or the keyboard and gives them some little practice activities. You may need just to give some instruction right on screen to explain if you're using an unusual kind of keyboard interface. And finally, when possible, it's preferable to provide full screen reader access to your materials. And when you can, that's the best way to go. In order to do this, you want to be really clear about what your learning goals are. You want to make sure you can support students in learning the thing that you hope they'll learn. And one place where this can be really useful and interesting is if your materials lend themselves well to audio experiences as well as visuals, then you may be able to build in some forms of audio feedback or sonification that helps to make a topic much clearer. And remember also is at the same time that it has to be visibly accessible as well for students who can't hear. When you're creating screen reader accessible materials, you'll need to describe your images and provide audio description for any videos. And here the key piece is to think about how that image or audio or visual is being used in context and to describe it functionally in the way that the student needs to learn to use it. Anna mentioned earlier that we have some videos in the BUAC collection that are NASA data visualizations, and they have no audio track with them. They're simply a visual of data over time, for example, global atmospheric motion patterns, things like that, or ocean currents. For those cases, it didn't make a lot of sense to try to do a real-time audio description, kind of a play-by-play style as the currents moved across the ocean or the atmosphere temperature changed. Instead, as we mentioned, we created offline materials where those image descriptions could be provided in structured paragraphs of text that can be read with a screen reader. And that's a more efficient way to extract that much data from a data visualization. But in some cases where the video is showing and talking about images in real time, it's important to have audio description so that students can learn from the audio description and the main narration track at the same time and in the right timing. Similarly, image description needs to hit the most critical elements that will support the student. It needs to be data focused. So rather than talk about the colors of the objects in a graph, you need to make sure that the image description conveys the data that's in the graph, so that students who are relying on that graph to perform, analysis or answer questions can meet those goals. And then finally, again, if you're making a screen reader accessible interactive and it requires some extra keyboard navigation, you'll want to make sure that screen reader users get that instruction and can find their way through the activity and enjoy it. And now Anna's going to talk a little bit about the production process that got us here.
All right, thank you. So our process evolved over the nearly now 5 years of the project, but there were some essential steps along the way. First, early on, working with our editorial and administrative teams and also in consultation with NCAM, we developed our initial accessibility plan, both for the editorial, all the content, and the technical. It helped to have this initial plan defined early so that we could incorporate it into our process and plan our work. But as the project evolved, so did some of our approach to how we manage accessibility. But it was important to have that at the beginning so that, especially where there are efficiencies in creating the accessible elements, we did that early on rather than having it be as an add-on later. This was particularly important when we determined which resources had to be fully accessible, and especially when that impacted an interactive activity that was necessary to know as it was being developed, as opposed to trying to retrofit it later, which is much more expensive and inefficient when it comes down to it. So unless we were taking an old interactive and deciding to incorporate it into the project and had to retrofit it after, it was great to know our plan from the ground up. So in terms of the editorial piece, the NCAM team trained our BUAC writers on how to write good image descriptions. Though all of our writers were skilled sort of for their grade level, for their content, this was something new to our team. So we learned how to write image descriptions, and to what Madeline was saying, when it was appropriate to point out certain details and when it became sort of extra stuff that students would have to sift through in order to get to the important key learning goals for that resource. So once the team was trained and we had our process, we incorporated it into our production. And so the writers developed the material at appropriate points for the editorial. Sort of once the content was finalized, we started to incorporate the accessibility elements so that they met the same goals and supported students' use of the resources. And so the writers created the image descriptions as well as all of those handouts and hands-on activities that you've seen during this presentation. And throughout, we regularly collaborated with the groups here. So with the NCAM team, they served as reviewers on the image descriptions, particularly at the beginning as the writers were first learning to craft descriptions. And we worked closely with them to help develop the alternative activities through brainstorms, and then as reviewers, as the writers came up with these handouts that students could use or the teachers could use to describe a hands-on activity. And they also served to consult on the development of new interactive activities and tools to make sure that those were accessible to the degree that we decided was appropriate for that particular activity. And then we worked with the media access group here at WGBH to do the closed captioning and also to create the audio descriptions, which our writers help to review. So these are the descriptions that are sometimes called DVS, for descriptive video service, for users who are blind. And I think that is it for the production process.
So now we'd like to take your questions. We know that you're here because you're working to create interactive materials and that you would like to make those accessible as well. And we are going to take time to work with each of you individually in the one-on-one consultations, but we thought we'd see what kinds of questions we could talk about today in the group. So I think I'm going to stop sharing and turn on video. And now let's take a look and see what kinds of questions have come up. Anne Holland asks, does anyone have experience with kiosks? Has anyone heard of a kiosk that would allow a screen reader to be plugged in, like in an exhibit space? Yes, there are accessible kiosks. There are accessible kiosks don't necessarily allow a user to plug in a separate screen reader, but instead are built to have audio options with them. So there are special kiosk accessibility software that makes a simple screen reader style interface on your kiosk. And it can be either on the touch screen itself or with a few simple buttons that are embedded in the panel. You might have seen this with accessible ATMs. ATMs are available now that offer audio feedback, and you can find them because they'll have a little headset jack built right into the ATM. And so that's the beginnings of that technology. That was where that kiosk style technology began. Next question I see is from James, and he says, full keyboard accessibility seems to be important. Is this still useful for mobile apps? Do people expect tablets with add-on keyboards and an expectation that apps will support keyboard input? That is an excellent question. Keyboard accessibility for mobile varies a lot from platform to platform. And the reason for that is that on iOS, there is no visible keyboard indicator unless you also turn on the screen reader, which is VoiceOver. So every Apple product has the VoiceOver screen reader built right in, and this includes everything from your desktop or laptop Mac down to your smallest phone. You can even use an Apple Watch with VoiceOver. So if you're using a tablet or phone with iOS, you have to turn on VoiceOver in order to see any visible keyboard indicator, which means that probably a person who can see but who's relying on a keyboard is either going to have to turn on speech they don't need, or they're not going to use keyboard only access on the phone or tablet. On Android, it's totally different. Android does support a visible keyboard indicator, which means that keyboard users can use Android apps from the keyboard alone if they are built accessibly. So there's still some testing and checking to be done to make sure that the app natively supports all of that keyboard interaction, but it is possible. So I don't see other questions right now. James, if you have any follow-up question about the keyboard for mobile, feel free. Anne asked if we have software recommendations for kiosk accessibility, and that's something that we can get you some links for is in the follow-up resources. So it sounds like several of you are in the museum space, and that's a very common place to need to make interactive exhibits like kiosks accessible. So that's a great place to be looking at. And says libraries too. What else are people working on and finding especially difficult? James says for mobile, the question is whether they should code to accept keyboard input. If it's not expected, it might not be used. Well, here's the beauty of it. If you're coding to make your app screen reader accessible, on iOS, that's the same thing as making it keyboard accessible. So you should be aiming to do that anytime where the material will be accessible by speech. If you're working on a visually intensive application where you don't expect screen reader users to use it, should you make your iOS app accessible anyway? I would say the keyboard piece shouldn't be difficult. And maybe Claire, can you jump in here and tell me whether you think that there's, is there a user base out there that's using VoiceOver even though they don't need the audio just to get the keyboard access?
I think there are some people who do. I don't know statistics wise how many people there are, but there definitely are people who need it for various things or are using other subsets of technology. That kind of, the more different ways of access for your apps you have, the more ways people can access it, including using voice control that may require some of the sort of built-in accessibility that you need if you have keyboard and voiceover accessibility. Then someone who's using speech control is better able to navigate the site as well. So you're kind of, by adding in all of those, you're going to be adding in more and more subsets of people who are able to access the application.
That's a really good point. We didn't speak about speech control so far. It's a newer technology, and it's mobile only for, well, it isn't mobile only. There's plenty of speech control apps for desktop, but we haven't worked on them in the BUAC project. But that's a really good point, because for speech interaction and speech control, what users need to be able to do is name objects in your interface and move the focus to them to activate them. And that's very similar to the way a screen reader accesses your app. And with the difference that the user may be looking at the screen and getting all the visual information that you're trying to convey. So I think in the end, we're going to come down on, yes, make your app keyboard accessible no matter what, if you can. Chad says VR, and those two letters say so much. Virtual reality is a challenging topic for accessibility, both from a keyboard and interface interactivity point of view and from a accessibility point of view. So there's a couple of things to think about there. One is soundscapes. If your VR has a natural sound component or can be converted to express itself in sound, then a sound-based VR experience can be really fun. And there are some accessible games that have been designed to be audio only, where you navigate the entire game through the soundscape and keyboard input. So it's certainly possible to give a VR experience with audio supports. It depends a little bit on what the material is that you're presenting and whether you can convert it from visual to auditory and get any kind of fidelity on the experience. Chad says, we're attempting some things, high contrast text, adding visual text and audio, mobility controls that don't require the user to move their body in a highly interactive space-based app. That sounds terrific. And you're right to raise mobility issues there as well for VR. Most users with physical disabilities are using some kind of assistive technology that either mimics a mouse or mimics a keyboard. So for example, they may be using an alternate way to provide keyboard input through a switch or through a manual device that they use with a keyboard. So they may not have full control over larger gestures if you're working with the kinds of the games where you can move your arms in space as the means of control. Not every user will have full access to that. So what's nice to do when you can is build in redundancy. Build more than one way to perform each action in the app. So if you can do it by waving your hands, that's easier for some users. If you can do it through keyboard access, then that's easier for many users, especially ones who can simulate that keyboard access through speech control or through switch access or through actually using a keyboard. So redundancy is your friend. Anne has an important and topical question. For the exhibit crowd, we're looking at cutting down touching due to COVID. Having these multiple options for interaction is relevant there too. So there's lots of things going on in the disability community to figure out how to deal with COVID. And for an interactive interface, it might be that the solution there is frequent cleaning, even between users, because if users can use it through voice control or through gesture-based captured with a camera, that's great, and that reduces touching for sure. But for those users whose only way of accessing it is by touching the interface, I think in some ways the best solution for virus control is going to be frequent wipe downs. But there may be some other more creative things as well. Anna or Claire, if you have any more thoughts on that, jump in. I think we're probably at the beginning of exploring how we're going to handle hands-on materials during COVID.
Okay, it looks like those are all the questions for this afternoon. I'm sure you've got specific questions that you will ask during your one-on-ones. If there's someone on the call who hasn't scheduled a one-on-one, can you just type your email in the chat box and we'll get in touch with you if you do want one. But I would like to thank Madeline and Claire from NCAM and Anna Brooks from our own education team for coming today and preparing this presentation. I hope it's been helpful for those of you thinking about how to move forward in this space. And we look forward to connecting and you know, helping you figure out your accessibility strategy moving forward. I see a couple of folks putting their emails in the chat box. Ethan, did you want to get on? I don't know if, I know sometimes we have several people from one group signing up, so I know we want to coordinate that, but you're the one who's collecting these names and going to help them get started scheduling. I know we haven't connected with them yet, but is that accurate?
Yes. Yep. Yeah, and I have, I believe, Anne, I've got you, Corey, Joan, and Paige. I've got your information, or at least your individual email addresses. I will be reaching out right after this webinar, probably later this week, with another form for you to fill out just to get a little better sense of your timing and schedules. And I believe that each of you are separate projects. And I think you'll have an opportunity to give me some more information when I reach out in the coming days. So.
And Ethan, you're capturing these other three actually emails that are in the chat box, right? Just to see if we don't have them. Looks like AMNH, Joan Harper Neely, and Paige Graff.
Yep, I've got all of those.
All right, great. Terrific. Well, thanks everyone. Get 8 minutes back in your day. Thanks NCAM, and we'll be checking in with you shortly.
Thanks everyone. We're looking forward to speaking to you about your materials.
Thank you all.
Take care.